Hey everybody, it's John here at the Pixel Expedition, and welcome to my second pixel art time-lapse video on the channel. Besides doing game reviews, I'm also an aspiring pixel artist and feel my work could be interesting or of use to others who are also learning. I'm still very much an amateur, but hopefully you'll enjoy the process and take something away from it. I've also set the commentary to some lovely instrumental music to round out the experience, and it's the kind of music that inspires me to create. So with this one, I wanted to create something run down, maybe abandoned, maybe a place barred off from trespassing. I love these kinds of places, so I felt inspired to create something along these lines. To start, I knew I wanted a fence that ran along a path, but has since been damaged and rusted over. In hindsight, I could have done a better job of holding onto this theme throughout the rest of the composition, but eventually I just let instinct take over and drew whatever felt right in the moment. I'm using the Sweet Canyon Extended 64 color palette from lowspec.com that I used last time. Although it's saturated, it's a great color range to start from, but because I didn't have any rust colors to work with, I started with gray for the fence, and then changed the hue to a reddish orange for each gray tone that would give me the rust colors I needed. And in case you're wondering why I have separate layers for the fence posts and panels, it's simply because I find it easier to put as many things in a scene on its own layer as possible for maximum control, especially as scenes become increasingly complex. You'll see that I end up using quite a few. It can get tedious having to constantly switch between the layers, but it makes for a less destructive workflow and can prevent a lot of major headaches when making changes. And so once I finished the fence panel, I was then able to copy and paste it several times to form a row along the path. And then I began the asphalt pad. I've been really loving this clean, minimalistic style of pixel art, using more transitional textures to illustrate surfaces that are normally more complex in detail. So instead of littering the asphalt pad with pixels to recreate all the little stones, I decided to dirty up the edges like I did with the path, and then add cracks to give the impression of the roughness of the terrain. And I also added little dark portions to the cracks that splinter out to give the illusion of depth. Just the same, I kept the grass nice and simple by drawing these little darker patches of green. And then where the grass meets an object, like this fence, I top it off with tufts of grass that just gives the essence of verticality and texture that the imagination can then carry the rest of the way. I then applied this same grass technique to the edge of the asphalt pad, as well as along the path. With a little more time, I would have preferred to draw the grass anew each time, but if this were specifically game art, I might have just created grass tiles that would have carried very little variation anyway. So I'm pretty happy with the result. I then decided to go back and add a few weeds to the asphalt cracks, just to add another level of detail. So as I said before, I wanted my fence to be exceptionally run down, so I went back and started cutting pieces out of the panels. You know, I really think pixel art is most fun when you can just freely remove and add pixels without worrying about precision of pixel placement. And then it was on to the building. I wanted to draw up a little maintenance shed, complete with painted yellow bricks and a corrugated metal roof. But before diving into a lot of the detailed work, I chose to tackle the door first. And this was a lot of fun, because I just kept adding layers of detail as they came to mind. The brick pattern was far too clean, so I decided to add some details like darker pixels for the crevices in the mortar, and then later some highlights to the corners of the bricks. But I mostly wanted to soften and age the look of the brick pattern by removing much of the line work and then also adding in some wall cracks. And then it was onto the roof. I had experimented with the corrugated metal look before, so I had a good idea of how I was going to do this. But it's really neat to see how the color gradient makes that ripple in the metal really stand out. Getting that 3/4 top-down view is not always easy, so it took some time to get the shape and proportions right. And that was true for everything else in the scene, but it's my favorite style of game art, so I'm trying to practice as much as I can. The lines I added across are meant to be the seams between the overlaid sheets of metal, but unfortunately, I'd forgotten to add the little curves along the edge to help sell the effect. But this was an opportunity to take the rust colors I created for the fence and use it here to weather and age the metal. So I've been practicing trees quite a bit, and while I'm still learning, I think this one turned out pretty well. I knew I wouldn't see the branches of the tree, so I decided just to draw the trunk, keeping the shading nice and simple. As for the leaves, I started by adding layers of color, moving the highlights closer and closer to the top to help achieve that top-down perspective. And then using the same 3-pixel size brush, which is the shape of a cross, I shaped each section to create the illusion of bunches of leaves. I then decided to shade in a dark green to provide a shadow underneath the foliage and help accentuate the shape. So I wanted to have some junk lying around the shed, but I couldn't decide what to draw. I didn't want to overcomplicate the scene, so I landed on drawing some stacks of tires and then some traffic cones. I might have added a lot more to the scene if it had been smaller, but I didn't want the time lapse to go too long. At the last second, I decided to add a wooden pallet. It took some trial and error, and then I realized I made it way too small, and the details are really not that correct, but it was gonna have to be good enough. Adding the highlights to the palette reminded me to add some highlights to the tires. They were looking a little flat, pun intended, but this really helped make them pop. So the last major step for the scene was adding shadows. Now this can make or break the depth of a scene. Being consistent is key, but not always easy when there are so many shapes to contend with. It was getting a little frustrating, so you'll see me bounce around a bit to avoid settling too long on any one object. And there are many imperfections. It's definitely something I would come back to and clean up a whole lot more. The tree was a little tricky. The shadow needed to be much lighter because light does pass through the leaves, but the shape had to be much less circular. Otherwise, it just looked terribly unnatural. But lastly, I wanted the fence to also cast a shadow. I copied and pasted the fence to a new layer, flipped it vertically, darkened it to black, and lowered the opacity so it looked like a shadow. But unfortunately, Aseprite doesn't allow you to stretch your selections diagonally. The best I could do was stretch it horizontally and offset the placement enough to try and fake it. It's far from perfect, but it's still a really neat effect. And there it is, the final scene. This was a much more labor-intensive than I intended, but I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you're new, and until next time on the Pixel Expedition, take care, stay safe.